It's not clear. I mean, it may have been from me. They may have touched in Egypt, but I'm unaware of that. They also may have stopped over in Italy. That was a quite common stopping point when the Jews left Spain in 1492. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, they arrived in the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul or Constantinople. I mean, fairly quickly already. In I would imagine within a year or so, they had arrived, and we know that there's the records of obviously the very prominent the physicians Joseph and his son Moses, who served as the physicians to Sultan Selim I, Selim Yavuz, and then obviously Suleiman the Magnificent. So yeah, and it's interesting. Now I don't have direct continuity in the family line, but I've known this since I was a child. My grandfather told me this, and I've also managed to connect with several different Amon branches around the world, and everyone has that same story, the same tradition, and of course the name is the same as well, exactly the same in Hebrew, that retains with an H, so Hamon, but obviously some of us kept the H and some of us didn't. Like my family, we dropped the H, so it's just Amon, but in Hebrew it still retains that hey sound, so it's still Hamon. 1492, so when the Jews are again expelled from Spain, the Sephardic Jews, it creates this really beginnings of a global diaspora, and the Sephardic Jews arrive in various cities, especially the port cities throughout the Mediterranean. And so, of course, they go to Italy, they go to Istanbul and Izmir and Salonika and Egypt and Syria, Lebanon, into Palestine or the land of Israel today, and many places. And of course, they go throughout North Africa, principally Morocco and some Algeria, Tunisia, etc. And then others, of course, who stayed on the peninsula ended up just going into Portugal and thought they had found a place of refuge until they too are forcibly converted to Catholicism. But the Jews who arrived in the Dar al-Islam find refuge. Of course, they're allowed to openly practice their Judaism. So my family, as far as I'm aware, arrived in Istanbul, as I said, about 1492, maybe 93, and then stayed there until the 1950s. When my grandparents married, my father was born, and then they moved to Chicago. Amon Effendi is my grandfather's grandfather, so he was born around 1850 or so, and what I know of him is pretty limited, but he was a rabbi, he was a professor or a teacher of mathematics, I think in the Ministry of Education, and he was also a member of the Istanbul Communal Council in the early 20th century. And in fact, when I did some research on him, the National Library of Israel also has some information on him, and it actually lists him specifically as one of the notable citizens of Kushta, of the city, in voting to select a new chief rabbi. And so that's really what I know about him. I know he died in around 1928, 1930. My grandfather, who was born in 1923, knew him as a little boy, but his grandfather died when he was about 5 or so, so he had very limited memories of him. But he also told me that this Ishaq Amon Effendi was offered the position to become chief rabbi of the Ottoman Empire, Hakam Bashi, around the time of the Turkish War of Independence, and he turned it down because he didn't want to get involved in politics. But nonetheless, he was obviously highly revered and esteemed, and his grave is located today in Istanbul in Arnavutköy in the Sephardic cemetery. And I had the honor to visit it, a few years ago when I came to Istanbul, and I saw it. And so he seemed like he was an incredible person. And I thought, I'll just add, when I was standing at the grave, I said, we're only separated by one person. So I thought that was a great moment, very moving. And the fact also we share, of course, the same name. Sephardic Jews, I think, have generally been noted for being fairly cosmopolitan, being integrated into many of their host societies and milieus. And especially, I might even say the Ottoman Empire, this is exemplified really maybe from a Levantine perspective that, obviously, a lot of them are obviously speaking Turkish, Greek, French. So my grandfather, because he was born in 1923, so 6 weeks after Ataturk proclaimed the Republic. So my grandfather was still, though, I think, was a final generation that saw the end of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, he obviously was educated early on with Ataturk's reforms in place. So he grew up speaking, Ladino, that Sephardic language, that's medieval Spanish with the mixture of Greek and Arabic and French and other languages thrown in. So he spoke Ladino with, I think, his grandparents, French with his parents. He also, I think, attended the Alliance Israélite Universelle schools that, of course, were dotted many cities in the Ottoman Empire. And he lived in a Greek neighborhood, so he spoke Greek with his friends. He learned Hebrew as a foreign language, but he obviously also used it for religious purposes. He learned German and Russian for scientific and research purposes. He was an engineer who attended Istanbul Technical University. I mean, it's probably one of the first students when it opened, or very early on, actually. He had to take an entrance exam, and he said it was the only school in all of Turkey that demanded it. If you wanted to become a doctor or a lawyer right away, you could go in, but the engineers were very specialized and again, very highly esteemed. So he had to take an entrance exam to get in. And then he also learned English because he was an attaché with the British Army. He served in the Turkish military, but then he also, I think during the Korean War, he was a translator or an attaché with the British Army. And then he perfected that, of course, when he came to the United States. So I think all in all, he spoke about 7 languages. And even until he passed, about 95 years old, just a few days before his passing, he was speaking in French, Ladino, Turkish with different people on the phone and in person. So he very much remained who he was throughout his life, a very cosmopolitan, Sephardic Jew who was very proud of being Turkish, and of also having met Ataturk as a teenager. He married my grandmother, of course, who was from Aleppo, but she really grew up in Beirut when World War II broke out. Her family moved there, so she went to Istanbul to visit her uncle, went to a wedding. It was a mutual friend of my grandfather's. They met there in the summer of 1952, and then they got married like 6 months later in December in the famous Neve Shalom synagogue. And they're married by the chief rabbi, who coincidentally had actually married my grandfather's parents when he was not yet chief rabbi 30 years earlier. So my father's line has, I think, long been integrated, long been enmeshed in Turkish history and identity. And unfortunately, we don't speak Turkish today, but it's obviously a very powerful memory and an enduring part, I think, of our story. More so because, he grew up in, even though he grew up in Chicago, of course, my grandparents normally spoke French at home, sometimes Turkish, though usually if they didn't want him to understand. But some of, I think, the food, some of the music, and that's something that, again, my father, I think, really grew up with, and I'm sure he could speak more to it. I mean, for me, I grew up here in St. Louis, and my Turkishness is expressed probably more in just the history and the memory. I mean, I've read a lot about it. Obviously, I admire the Ottoman Empire, and I talk about it at different times, especially vis-a-vis Sephardic Jewry. And of course, my grandfather was very big on, me understanding the significance of Ataturk and what he did and his reforms for the country. So again, I think just more in trying to keep the memory alive in the history. And I'd also just say that I did enjoy my visit to Istanbul a few years ago, and I obviously hope to come back and see more. I felt I only scratched the surface. So it's hard for me to say anything specific, but again, it's just more of the history, the memory, and some other things. My grandfather brought some documents, some other things, some art of family history from heirlooms from Turkey that we keep and preserve, and I'm always glad to show them off to people, to say there are Jews in Turkey. It was a very, unique story, I think, very phenomenal. And it's something, a memory, I think, that a lot of people have nostalgia for. Because I like to say too that, the Jews never left, in a way, the Jews have never left Turkey, and Turkey has never left the Jews. My grandparents, when they moved, my grandfather moved because he had a teaching opportunity to become an engineer. So he moved, and I think they only had one or two friends in Chicago. They really knew no one, and they never intended to stay as long as they did. I think he had a 1-year contract, and of course they stayed for 55 years. So my grandfather's parents still lived in Istanbul until they passed in the late 70s, or maybe around even early 80s. So my grandfather's parents are there. They're buried there. I also had the chance to visit their graves when I was in Istanbul in 2019. And he used to tell me about different friends he had. I don't, we presumed many of them had passed. But was really interesting is he used to show me, he'd go on Google Maps and he would tell me, this is where we lived. This is the apartment. He'd show me on Büyükada and the Princess Islands, and he'd say, you have to go, and there's no cars allowed. And, we had these cherry trees. He actually had us plant cherry trees in the backyard and then try to grow and have the sour cherries, because he said we used to have this in Istanbul. So yeah, for his whole life, he loved the Turkish food, obviously Turkish sayings. I mean, the one thing I do know is just whenever I leave the house, he'd say "Güle güle git, güle güle gel, güle güle." So obviously he was very big on some Turkish phrases, aphorisms, and keeping that going, and some of the food and the music, and obviously again the history overall of just the Ottoman Empire and then modern Turkey. So yeah, he remained, I think, a true Turk, a Jewish Turk or Turkish Jew through his whole life. The other thing I want to say is he did go back to Turkey a few times to lecture. I think the last time he went back was the late 90s or maybe 2000. And he told me, and this is kind of funny, that it had been 40 years since he had left. So his Turkish was considered by many people to be, what's the word, ossified or fossilized, because he hadn't learned any new Turkish idioms or expressions. So he gave this lecture in this Turkish, and someone said, your Turkish is already old. And he said, where are you getting your phrases from? It's like it was in an icebox. And he says, I haven't lived here in 40 odd years. So his Turkish was, again, I think that first generation of Turkish from Ataturk's time. So I always got a kick out of hearing that story, that it was already old when he would go back to lecture in Turkey. He would go to different conferences and speak on engineering, I think, or even architecture. He was I think a civil engineer. So he would design bridges and buildings. I don't remember exactly where. It may have been, I'm trying to remember. I mean, I don't know if it was Bill Kent or is it Roberts College. I assume maybe my dad could speak maybe more to exactly where he went, but he always told me too, when you go to a conference, it's important to also see the city, not just to be stuck in the. I remember too that we used to talk very frequently about Turkish politics or Turkish current events and what's going on, and also I just add too one other thing. When I did go to Istanbul in 2019, I went to the chief rabbinate as well, the Hahambashi, and they still had a copy of my grandparents' marriage certificate, the ketubah. So they gave me a copy of that. So that was very nice, very moving. It's obviously in Turkish, and it was very interesting to see. It didn't come as a shock to them. I mean, they were well aware of what it was like, and they always enjoyed that aspect of it. I mean, to them, I think the shock is when they encountered people of whatever religion or whatever group who had been closed off or never been exposed to someone else's belief system or ideas, and or another language. And so they'd say, well, how are you speaking this language? Jews don't necessarily speak. They said, well, what are you talking about? Of course, it's just a language. Or the fact that, again, my grandmother, when she spoke Arabic, would obviously say inshallah, mashallah, alhamdulillah, etc. And sometimes people say, well, what is a Jew doing? I said, well, okay, so you're obviously ignorant of the history. I mean, again, Allah is just a name for God. So yeah, they were well prepared for it, and they enjoyed this, again, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, linguistic, society. And in fact, just to add, I'd say, sometimes people in the West and say really Western Europe and in America to a larger extent, they think that sometimes the concept of secularism and the concept of this multi-ethnic society is something new in the annals of history, and it's something like no one else ever had to deal with these issues. And obviously that's not true. I mean, things changed, of course, maybe to have equality at a political level, a civic level, etc. But the idea of religious tolerance and the idea of relative amity between, say, the monotheistic, Abrahamic faiths is nothing new. And all you have to do is look at the Ottoman Empire to see that. I mean, so centuries before the concepts are coming into Western Europe, when Jews are not permitted to do almost anything and are being persecuted and victimized quite frequently, obviously they're enjoying a relatively good existence in the Ottoman Empire. I mean, I've always been interested in history. As I said, I knew from an early age I wanted to learn the stories. So, and I thought that I mean, I had a fairly interesting, I think, somewhat unique background in the sense that, again, my father's side is the Sephardic side, or sometimes the Jews from Aleppo are called Halabi or Mustarabi, the Arab Jews. So I had one set of grandparents who were coming from that type of society and culture, and then my mom's side is the traditional Ashkenazi Jewish experience from Eastern Europe, from Belarus, Lithuania, Ukraine. And in fact, her mother, my other grandmother, actually escaped a pogrom against Jews in the Russian Empire as late as 1919, 1920. So in 100 years ago, as a little girl, she escaped and came to Ellis Island in 1922. So I had this other set of grandparents who spoke Yiddish, and again, this traditional, again, Ashkenazi Jewish experience in the United States. So, I had this synthesis of different lived experiences and cultural attitudes. Sometimes languages are different, foods are different, the music's different. So it was always interesting, I say, at Passover, because my grandparents, the Sephardic ones in Chicago, would come to St. Louis. My other grandparents, especially my grandfather, were living here. My grandmother passed when I was little, but I mean, I do remember her on that side. So, so it's always an interesting melange of different, as I said, different experiences and perspectives on Jewish identity. And then growing up, I was privileged to know my grandparents. So again, I learned from them from a very early age. I mean, my grandfather, I'll just share this, on my mom's side, was born in 1913, so before World War I. And he told me he remembered when the Americans entered the First World War in 1917, when he was 4. One of the doughboys, called the Americans, picked him up and said, "Son, I'm off to war." And of course, that's what ultimately led to the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire later on. But so I had this, grandparents who had seen a lot of things and had many different, again, experiences. So I was always fascinated by them growing up, and I was privileged to know them and speak with them firsthand, to learn a lot of their stories. And I actually thought about going into history, but I was also fascinated by law to a large extent, and I wanted to become a lawyer because I also wanted to help people in a different way. I never had the mathematical mind. I love the history of mathematics and the history of science, but in terms of doing the experiments, or especially the mathematical computations, that's not me, and it never has been. So I went into law, and I still do a little bit. I still practice. I keep my license, but lately I've I got into teaching somewhat because I enjoy sharing the information, the knowledge with other people. And I like exposing people to things they may not be aware of and to trying to really correct, people's misperceptions. And so I was, even when I was practicing, um, I would basically on the side, I would sometimes give lectures or presentations at different places, really just in St. Louis, to synagogues and community centers, etc. And anyway, during COVID, I, obviously things shut down and everything went online. And so I had the opportunity to give some more talks. And anyway, I ended up getting introduced to to the Jewish Heritage Alliance, which is an educational organization whose core mission is really to help research, preserve, and promote the legacy of Sepharad and the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula to the world at large, because that's a story that's traditionally undertold and it's really unknown by a lot of people, Jewish and non-Jewish. And so having the personal interest from my grandfather's side from Turkey back to Spain, but also being interested from a legal perspective, how did the Inquisition operate? What was the criminal procedure like? What happened to the accused? And having that interest in criminal justice, the interest kind of converged, if you will, the personal and professional. And so I basically had an opportunity to join the Jewish Heritage Alliance to say, here's a big platform. We are an organization with, around 50 different partnering organizations and communities and museums and universities and anyone really, and it can always grow, anyone who's interested to help promote this story, this legacy. And so I said, okay, and I thought about it and I ended up joining. So I still do some law, but lately I've been lecturing more and presenting on Sephardic Jewry or the Inquisition or the expulsion or some variant thereof. I mean, the fact is that really the Sephardic Jews went everywhere and they've impacted to a large extent, a lot of history in many different places. So I think any one of these could be a lifetime of study. And I'm trying to present an overall, portrait to many people, sometimes in the academic world, in the academic scene, but sometimes just to regular communities. So, so that's kind of what led me to do this. But yeah, you're right. But I'm a lawyer. I have two brothers, and one is in computer science, and another one is real estate. So none of us became engineers.